Hey, what's going on, guys? Appreciate you joining me. This is our video on sequencing, which is probably one of the most important things that you need to know for Riptide. I want to do a quick shout out for Kane, who put a lot of effort into these PowerPoints. Overall, all of us have put a lot of effort into making this video happen, and it's, in my honest opinion, one of the most important ones that you'll see. So let's get straight into it. Okay, first thing we're going to go over is resolving Riptide's ability himself and how to properly sequence it. So let's assume you have two cards in hand, doesn't matter what the other one is, and one is a tar pit, and we're assuming that it triggers. So when you play the tar pit, Riptide's ability to reload first goes up. So the ability resolves, and then you get a reload if you want to. After that happens, and Riptide's ability leaves the stack, you still have tar pit. Tar pit resolves, going onto the stack, and then triggering. The trigger happens, going on the stack, but because the trigger also happens, Riptide's ability goes on the stack. You can resolve these in any way, but in all reality, you're usually resolving the ping first. So the ping happens, and then tar pit trigger happens. That's usually the proper way to do that. A lot of people shortcut these so that it's just kind of like, hey, I'm going to do this, ping, and then reload. You don't have to do it any specific way, but understanding how it functions and how it works is really good to understand. Another thing to note is to make sure that when you use an effect, or specifically in the instance of Riptide, that you give proper response time or the ability for someone to react, in the case of, say, Prism, and that you reload with Riptide before you resolve any other effects, it'll matter here in a second, then you get priority again, and then you can play the arrow. The reason why this matters a lot is because there are some things that sequence a little bit odd. So, for example, Rabble. So, Rabble is a part of the resolution of the card. So, when you play Rabble, the way that it's going to sequence is first, you choose whether or not you Riptide. So, let's say we decide to put our arrow here because we have a 2-card hand. Rabble resolves after this is done to then reveal this. So now this is coming in for 4. And then that's how we properly sequence that. And then you come in with your arrow again. So, offense is when things start to get a little tricky. Now, for control, fatigue, mid-range type decks, you're really only throwing one attack, so your sequencing doesn't matter hugely, but sometimes it can if you have a specific hand. We'll just go over more of the aggro version just to highlight a few specific details and understanding how certain things function. So, an example here, we have these cards. So we were wanting to maximize our value and distribute our on hits correctly, so that you can hide info but also have as much breakpoints as possible. So sometimes it's worth just throwing all your buffs out there, putting that card in Arsenal, and then throwing the Rabble, making sure that you get this to apply the on hit, but hyper buff this arrow. They don't know what this is, but they know that these are coming. Now this does reveal information, but you do get 2 instances of potential Premeditate. Now in certain decks where, say, they have like Rampart and it's Guardian, where you don't want to break the chain, then you end up trying to do that. But in any other decks where you don't really care if the chain gets broken, you play like this, and then try to hide information so that now this comes in for 10. So you're coming in for 14 here, but now they didn't know about the on hits on these, so you distribute your on hits to punish not blocking, because you have the ponder so you don't care, but now they may need a block because of the other effect. Now, this changes a lot, and in some cases, say whenever they have a Fleshbag, then you wanting to do this as well because you want to play this, put that in Arsenal, and empty your hand completely, full damage, and they cannot get Scowling off. So you got to make sure that you are aware of things like that, or the new one for Runeblade. Another instance of sequencing would be, say we have these 4 cards and a card in Arsenal. So just assume that we're trenching, so that's one resource. And activate Dreadbore, we'll say. So we put in that Bolt and Shot gets +1. Now we have 2 disruption effects. This comes into a weird slot where which one do you want more? So we'll say sometimes D-Reacts can brick hands when you have Dreadbore, so sometimes keeping them in the deck is better. So you put the on hit that you think that they're going to block aggressively, so we'll say in this first, and then send this. Now they look at this and they say, well, there's 2 on hits there, I don't want them to get another card in Arsenal, or for some reason or another they don't want Seek and Destroy to trigger. And then you do that. So it's the same effect, but you're sequencing in a way that you can maximize what you specifically need without giving your opponent either information or really the choice to block. Because now this on hit is actually worse. So you're distributing your on hits to make this seem like it's a higher density threat, while in reality this one is a higher density threat. So when you start throwing different bows like Death Dealer or your arms into the mix, things start to get a little bit weirder. So we'll go with that same example before, but instead we're going to talk about Death Dealer. So in the case of Death Dealer, you're wanting to try to maximize your actual potential damage value, and putting in your last arrow usually ends up doing that. So in the case of this hand, we don't want to put this in first sometimes, because we have enough buffs to make sure that we get it in there and also buff it. But there's always the chance that we draw something that changes the dynamic of the turn, or that we would rather play and then bank this arrow for another turn. So we'll go with this play, and Death Dealer, putting in our Drill Shot. So Drill Shot's going to be the finisher, and in this case, we draw Codex instead. So this changes our entire play pattern just because of the existence of this, and what our bow is. So let's go and do the same play as before, instead playing Seek, reloading with Riptide, and then coming in with Bolt and Shot. So they still know what this information is, but we still have this hidden, and this still looks very threatening. So let's say they really want to protect their arsenal, and they don't think they can deal with this damage, and you still have 2 cards in hand. So they're going to block it. Okay. Now, we break the chain. These go to graveyard. Play Lace. And then play our Codex. To get this back into Arsenal. Hopefully maybe... Well, they already have an Arsenal, so it doesn't matter. Get our Ponder. If we had a different arrow, we could have instead grabbed it and say just come in for... Maybe it's a Searing Shot. But in this case, we have Bolt and Shot, and we have the buffed, so we send it again. Now with another on hit. So now they have to block this again for 7, which realistically they probably can't. And then we finish with this to destroy some armor. And in this case, we maximized our efficiency. Even though we gave information, we sacrificed information for just slightly more efficiency on our on hits and more overall advantage. With Codex, there's a couple different plays that you can do that are really relevant that utilize our Riptide ability. So we'll say that you want to play this 1 cost whenever you have a Codex and card in hand. We'll just assume it's some random arrow, but you decided, I don't like this arrow, so you're going to try to play this one from grave. So when you play Codex, the stack will work like this. Play Codex, Riptide ability goes on the stack. We say, okay, I'm going to use Riptide's ability and put this other card I had in there in my arsenal. Codex is still resolving, so we activate Trench. With this card on the bottom, gain a resource. Trench resolves, Codex resolves. So we grab this, and then send it for 5 with the resource that we banked. This is an essential play whenever you're playing with Codex, as well as just understanding that you can in fact still pitch to bow, you don't have to have an arrow or place an arrow in, pitch to bow, float your resources, and then say come in with a CNC or a Murky Water. So some other small little plays or patterns that you'll see is, for example, whenever you have a arrow face up and you have buff and Codex. And if you have a bolt and shot in graveyard, sometimes it is better to just buff, Codex, grab bolt and shot, send it, send this. But let's say you have a yellow or a blue bolt and shot in grave, and you really don't want that damage because it's going to be easier to block at a 5 or a 6 than it is going to be at a 7. So in some cases, you'll just say, okay, I'll play Lace, Codex, and grab a Rav Rabble. And then you can send the Rav Rabble. Especially for the redline deck, this typically ends up equaling 4 to 3 no matter what. But what this does is it guarantees that this on hit instead goes on to here. So sometimes the sequencing is just better. Another case is, let's say that you have this, an arrow, and a resource through another card, trenching, whatever, it doesn't matter. And we'll just assume that you have Dreadbore here. No extra cards. So sometimes you do what is referred to as banking arrows whenever you have stuff like New Horizons. And you put the card face up that you do not want to use. In the case, we'll say you want to keep this Endless Arrow, so you're going to Dreadbore, put in the Endless Arrow, play that, Arsenal, and then send this, keeping this face up. A usual, more appropriate situation would be when you have Premeditate and you send this for 7, so that if it does hit, you guarantee a second Arsenal. But banking arrows can be very valuable sometimes because it lets you effectively use your hand if you couldn't use it all for some reason or another, and prevent additional bricks that can happen with the deck by guaranteeing you an arrow, or in the case that you have, say, a bolt and shot, makes your turn a little bit wider. Another thing that you need to be aware of is that, and many people forget about this, Premeditate can in fact reload things like CNC, and CNC can be played from Arsenal to come in for 9. Be aware of this. I have done this many occasions. It is very good. Do not forget about that. One last thing for the offensive, line it up. There's been a lot of questions about line it up, so we're just going to solve it right here. Whenever you play line it up, we'll say with the blue, the way that it resolves is first line it up, then Riptide triggers, so you can put something in Arsenal. Riptide resolves as a result, and then line it up triggers, and it says, hey, you may turn a face down arrow in your Arsenal face up, and then put a name counter on it. Oh hey, look, it's a Murky Water. We put a name counter on it. Now it gets +3 plus its +1 from own effect, and we come in for 10 Dominate off of 3 cards. This card is really valuable for these aim type of decks, so be aware of sequencing this correctly. You can even, we'll say with Barbed Castaway and a regular buff, you can play Arsenal, pitch, Barbed, flip, same thing. Be aware of these small little plays that can actually massively affect your output of your turn. Next, we're going to talk about the defensive side of playing Riptide and resolving his abilities. So, one of the first notes to have is that whenever you do have New Horizons actually destroys your Arsenal after the chain resolves. So let's say you have a trap in Arsenal, and they're coming in for 5, you need to block it. You can block with New Horizons if you have identified that you no longer get value out of it, and there's no reason to keep it. And then go to D-Reacts, and play it, block 5, chain is not ended yet, so therefore you will not lose your Arsenal. Chain resolves, these go, you still got max value out of your Arsenal. A big part of playing Riptide is also understanding how your traps resolve. A really huge interaction is making sure that you understand that Buzzsaw Trap can prevent you from triggering some of your other effects. So, in this case, you would want to make sure that you resolve your Inertia Trap first before you resolve your Buzzsaw Trap. I like playing, resolving all the triggers, including Riptide, and then going, okay, and then I'll play Buzzsaw Trap. The reason why I do this is because I don't want to leave any margin of error. I want to make sure that I'm going through the proper steps, I'm communicating the proper steps, because people get confused about Riptide stuff. And I want to make sure that I resolve my abilities correctly, that I think about them, because otherwise I could really screw myself. So you want to make sure that you resolve it first, and then second. There are ways that you can manipulate the way that you've played it, but for the most part, you want to make sure that these cards resolve first. So if you play this, and then play this, and let this resolve, then let this resolve, that still works. There are some times where it also changes with things like pulping, where you have go again, and let's say it has +1 from a mic token. Let me grab my go agains. So if you resolve your inertia trap first, and we'll say you reload, and then you resolve your tar pit trap, the resolution will happen where it says, hey, you're blocking with 2 cards. I lose go again. So then this doesn't trigger. You need to make sure that you instead play it the other way around so that you make sure to get both triggers. So there are small microplays that you have to make sure you think about through your interactions. Otherwise, you could potentially lose damage or lose efficiency. There are some weird interactions with Rillen, which we'll talk about in a second. But it comes down to the whole dominate effect, which we navigate around perfectly. So let's say that you have this trap in Arsenal and 2 traps in hand, and they send 9 dominate. You're at 1 life. You need to block it all. So you play the trap from Arsenal, play the trap from hand, Riptide ability, put in Arsenal, play it from Arsenal. You've blocked effectively 9 off of only using 2 cards from your hand and 1 card in Arsenal. Riptide gets to dodge around dominate effects pretty efficiently as long as you handle it correctly. Rillen throws a little bit of a weird wrench into that because of the way that it resolves. So we're going to play Rillen. Okay. First, Rillen goes on the stack, Riptide goes on. We'll go ahead and throw this tar pit. Alright, tar pit. We'll play it after the Riptide ability is resolved. Played on the stack. Now, Rillen will trigger. We'll say, hey, cool, look, we got all these cards now. So we got these. Final resolution is the reload effect. We'll Arsenal this card. And then play a trap from Arsenal off of the reload. Now we still haven't played any card onto the chain link from our hand. So we're going to play this trap from hand. Arsenal with Riptide. Then play from Arsenal. We've effectively blocked 12, only blocking 1 card from hand. Rillen's a really nifty card, and as we get more support, this card becomes better and better. But as it stands now, it's inefficient for how the game is currently, but keep a note of it. Another major thing to be aware of, and just assume this is any blue, is whenever your opponent is playing, say, Assassin, and they're coming at you with a Bonds of Agony, you get to utilize your hero ability and quiver. So let's say you play Remembrance, you have this card in hand and they come out at you with the Bonds. You blocked it with 3 and then a card from Arsenal, but they went over. Doesn't matter. You can play your Remembrance to trigger Riptide, put this 0 for 4 into Arsenal. Riptide fully resolved, Remembrance resolves, and then use your quiver to completely get rid of your hand. So these are some of the plays that you can do to just dump your hand to deny value to the opponent. And in this case, that on hit equals maybe with just a nick, just banishing a single card from the top of your deck, which you've already put 6 cards back, and then you taking 4 or 5 some damage. But now, on the backswing, you still get to send your 4, and if they don't block it, you're going to put it back in Arsenal. So navigating around the defensive side of things, especially with Assassins, can really turn the tide of battle and give you a lot of either deck damage or deny your opponent from contract effects or the like. Okay, some final notes. I want to talk about a little bit more on the defensive side of sequencing to hide information. We'll say that this is your hand. The best case scenario is that you can read your opponent correctly and try to put this into Arsenal last minute if you know that you have to block with 3 cards. Now, if you end up waiting too late, you'll end up with this card and then just put it in Arsenal, and not being able to send the damage. If you try to conserve cards, then you may end up taking more damage than you want and just wasting efficiency, and you get like maybe 1 extra damage off of it, off of Dreadbore. And if you do it too early, they throw a CNC at you, and you just get completely screwed. So, you want to make sure to do this at the last possible moment, so that you can then instead send it without getting punished and maximizing your value by getting that 0 for 4 into Arsenal, for example. Another thing I really want to talk about, because this has been a question that has been asked 1.5 million times. Triggers that you control, like Seek and Destroy and Stone Rain, are yours to sequence when the priority step at the end of the turn happens. Stuff like tokens are under the control of your opponent. They control these tokens, so it resolves when their effects resolve. Your effects, their effects. Even though you gave them to them, it's their effects. So, when they choose to resolve their effects first, like say resolving Inertia and then resolving their Ponder, they can do that because they can sequence their effects correctly to be able to do that. However, if they have a Ponder and you have a Stone Rain, Seek and Destroy, and they say, well, I'm going to resolve this, and then get my Stone Rain, Seek and Destroy will still trigger. In this case, whatever card they got from Stone Rain goes away, and then their Ponder resolves. Or let's say they really want that card back to be able to try to Blood Route Pox and get rid of it because they know it's blue. Well, they can't do that correctly because they have to say player resolves their effects, other player resolves their effects, and then I get to choose which order. And in this case, you choose Stone Rain, resolves first, gives card back, Seek and Destroy resolves, destroys it. So, to wrap this up, the player who's active player, at the end of their turn, these triggers all go in the stack, and then they choose which player's effects go on first and second. They control the tokens, you control the Seek and Destroy or the Stone Rain. So therefore, they choose the player, not the effects themselves. I appreciate joining me and having patience for me going really, really in-depth for all these certain effects. I think it's important to know them as finely as you can. Anyways, watch out for our next videos.